Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the class of biology on the fascinating world of biology. Throughout this course, we will learn about pollination and their types, self pollination, and cross pollinations. Here, our main purpose is to improve our reading skills. Now, let's start to the reading of pollination. Pollination in order for flowering plants to reproduce sexually, the pollen grains must be transferred from the anther to the stigma so that the male and female gametes can later be brought together. This transfer of pollen grain is called pollination. It means that pollination is a process, the transfer of pollen grains from anther to another plants of anther is called pollination. Pollination is usually brought about by insect or wind. The factor of which involves for pollinations like insects or wind. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma is called pollination. Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or of a different flower on the same plant. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from one plant to the stigma of a flower in another plant of the same species. It means that self-pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of the same flower is called self-pollination, and cross-pollination is transfer of pollen grain from one plant the anther to another plant is called cross-pollination. Now we look at this picture self-pollinations. Here is the same plant is present and the structure is called anther. In the anther, pollen grains are present. Here are inside the pollen grains are present. This structure called anther. Transfer of pollen grains like this and other flower of the same plants. Stigma. This structure is called stigma and the anther. This process is called self-pollination. Transfer of pollen grain, same plant, same flower is called self-pollination. Self-pollination. In self-pollination, the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of the same flower or a different flower in the same plant. Self-pollination, transfer of pollen grains, same plant on the flowers. Features favoring self-pollination. Flowers are bisexual with anthers and stigmas maturing at the same time. The stigma is situated directly below the anther. In certain plants with bisexual flowers, some flowers never open. These closed flowers are called cleistogamous flowers. Closed, only self-pollination can occur in these flowers. What are the advantage of self pollinations? Advantage of self pollinations. Only one parent plant is required. The offspring inherits its genes from the parent plant. Hence, beneficial qualities are more likely to be passed down to the offspring. It does not depend on external factors such as insects or wind for pollination. Since the anthers are close to the stigmas of the same flowers, there is a high probability that self-pollination will occur. Hence, self-pollination is more likely to take place than cross-pollination. Less pollen and energy is wasted in self-pollinations as compared to cross-pollinations. Now we discuss about the what are the disadvantage of self-pollination. The offspring's genes are similar to those of the parent plant, so less varieties of offspring are produced. The species is less adapted to change in the environment. Continued self-pollination may lead to offspring become weaker, smaller, and less resistant to disease. Clistogamous flower closed. Clisto means closed pollinations, open flower and closed flower. Cross pollinations. In cross pollination, pollen grains are transferred to a flower in anther plant of the same kind or species. Cross pollinations mean plant A, plant B. Anther is present and inside anther pollen grains are present. Transfer of pollen grains and other plant B. This process is called cross pollination, but in self pollination, same plant, same flower or different flower, but plant is same. And in cross pollinations, one plant transfer of pollen grain into another plants. Feature favoring cross pollination. Dioecious plants bear either male or female flowers so that self-pollination is impossible. For example, papaya. In many plants with bisexual flowers, the anthers and the stigma may mature at different times. The stigmas of plants with bisexual flowers may be situated some distance away from the anther so that self-pollination is unlikely. What are the advantages of cross-pollination? Offspring produced may have inherited beneficial qualities from both parents. More varieties of offspring can be produced, that is, there is greater genetic variation. This increases the chance of the species surviving changes in the environment. For example, any change in the environment is less likely to destroy all the varieties in a species. More viable seeds are produced. Such seeds are capable of surviving longer before germination. What are the disadvantages of cross pollination? Two parent plants are required. It depends on external factors such as insects, or wind for pollination. Since the pollen grains have to be transferred from the anther of one plant to the stigma of another plant, there is a lower probability that cross pollination will occur compared to self pollination. Hence, cross pollination is less likely to take place than self pollination. More energy and pollen is wasted as compared to self pollination. Advantage of genetic variations. Blight is a plant disease that greatly damages cultivated rice crops in Asia. One way of fighting blight is by cross pollinating cultivated rice plants that cannot fight the disease with wild rice plants that can. The resulting offspring may be harder and resistant to blight. Yin Zong Koi, a Singaporean researcher at the Temasek Life Sciences Laboratory, crossbred hardy wild rice plants with cultivated rice plants that were no resistance to blight. After more than 2 years, he succeeded in creating a blight resistant strain benefiting rice farmers all over Asia. Look at this wild rice cultivated plants. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower of a different flower on the same plant. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grain from one plant to the stigma of a flower in another plant of the same species. Cross-pollination produces healthier offspring and more variation in offspring. More variation in the species enables them to adapt to changes in the environment, thus increasing their chance of survival. An insect pollinated flower, Calitoria. The Calitoria flower is pollinated by insects. The flower is complete, bisexual, and bilaterally symmetrical. Strand petal with nectar guides. Corolla, calyx, calyx. This part is called calyx, and upper part is epi mean upper calyx, pedicel, wing petal. Look at this strand petal. Nectar guide is here present, wing petal, keel petals. External features of a Calitoria flowers magnification. The calyx consists of 5 green sepals. The base of the calyx is enclosed by the apicalyx. The apicalyx consists of 2 green leaves. The corolla consists of 5 brightly colored petals of different shape and size. The large deep blue standard petal has lines on it that guide insects to where the nectar is located. Thus, these lines are called nectar guides. Two deep blue wing petals are enclosed by the standard petal. Two small yellowish green keel petals are enclosed by the wing petals. The keel petals enclose the reproductive organs. Androecium. The androecium consists of 10 stamens with long filaments. The filaments of 9 of these stamens are fused along most of their length to form a hollow tube or trough. This trough encloses the pistil. Nectar secreted by the flowers collects at the bottom of the stamen trough. Thus, the nectar can be reached only by an insect with a long tubular mouth or proboscis. For example, a bee or a butterfly. Look at these charts, diagram, tables and try to understand the process of pollination. Stigma. The stigma is small and compact. It is located at the end of the style. Here our stigma is present. Style. The style is a long, curved, hairy structure. Style, long structures, hairy structures, and in curved shape structure is called style. Pistil. The pistil consists of a single carpel. In the upper side of the style, a pistil is present, single carpel. Ovary. The ovary is long and narrow with a single row of ovules. Here's our ovary present. Here are ovary present, and inside the ovary in row shaped ovules, ovus means eggs are present, section of the carpel. And look at this diagram. Here are dotted rounded shape structures are called stigma and stamens. Styles, stamen through the 10th stamens is free. Pollination. In its natural states, the flower is inverted with the standard petal at the bottom. When a heavy insect such as a bee visits the flower, it lands on the standard petal. The insect follows the nectar guide into the flower. The insect crosses its way in between the two wing petals and moves in to collect the nectar. The insect's back forces the keel petals upwards to expose the stigma and the anthers. The stigma and anthers brush against the hairy back of the insect. When this happens, some pollen grains from the anther stick to the hairy back of the insect. At the same time, pollen grains on the insect's back from anther flower which the insect had visited earlier are transferred to the sticky stigma. When the insect leaves the flower, the keel springs back to its original position to enclose the stamens and the stigma again. Although the flower is well adapted to insect pollination, self-pollination can still occur. Half flower of Calitoria showing insect pollination. Calitoria flower is present here. Insect entering flower to collect nectar. Here are insect entering into flower and collect nectar. Keel petal are here present and anther are here present. Wing petals, standard petal. Now in this structure, in this lesson, we will learn about self-pollinations, cross-pollinations and pollinations. I hope this lecture is very useful for those students who are very weak in the reading skills. We will meet our in next class. Thank you so much for listening these lectures. We will meet in our next class with new topics. Thank you.